Counter-Narrative News brings you the third in the series on the anti-war series that we've been doing. The first of the three was a history of the anti-war movement in the West. The second was around the big global demonstration against the impending war in Iraq in February 2003, and this one will be focusing on the Iraqi resistance as the Iraqi people's response to the British and USA invasion and occupation of their country, which was initiated on 15th of March, 20 years ago today in 2003. Fundamentally, the problem here, as with all southern continents, are the colonially imposed borders around which constitute the Iraqi state. Of course, Iraq itself is an ancient state. It's one of the first civilizations of humanity, along with the Egyptian and Nubian civilizations, the Yemeni, and also the Indian civilization of Harappa. However, the modern Iraqi state was formed by the British. It carved out a province of Iraq, which is today called a state called Kuwait, which we'll come to in a second. And really, it cuts through Kurdish areas, Turkmen areas, also cuts through tribal, cuts in between tribal areas. So it really sets up these states for a lot of tensions and conflict going forward, of which they have produced throughout the southern continents. Then we come to the political nature and the class composition of the Iraqi Ba'athist state. Now, this pertains to a fundamental issue here. What is the political nature of the state, its leadership, its ideology, which can only be understood by a class analysis, a class composition of that phenomena or phenomenon? And this is a form of Arab socialism and Arab nationalism called Ba'ath, which has its roots with Michel Aflaq sometime in, if one's not mistaken, in the late 40s, early 50s. He's a Syrian Christian, actually, Michel Aflaq, although he then kind of jumps ship and he kind of becomes embedded into the Iraqi Ba'ath. The Syrian-Iraqi Ba'ath split. And what is Ba'athist ideology? It's an ideology that leans on heavily and internalizes heavily the European concept of the nation state. As a colonized people, like many others, they were looking for frameworks to successfully push back against the colonizing mission by the Europeans, and often many colonized people looked to Western forms of the nation state as what they thought was the most strongest, the most effective way. But in so doing, a lot of right-wing Eurocentric nationalist ideas are also internalized, and that's very much the case as well in this particular form of Arab nationalism, Baathism, whereby there are some right-wing elements. It's not particularly useful around minorities, linguistic minorities, and other national and religious minorities. The Arabic language is the binding glue centrally, so there's a lot of emphasis on that can become quite chauvinistic. For example, the Syrian state has refused the Kurdish people to officially recognize the Kurdish language there, and also the Syrian state is a good example of how far right, pardon the pun, the internalization is, with them aligning closely with the global neo-Nazi and white nationalist movements in the form of David Duke, Alexander Dugin, Nick Griffin, etc., and very much internalizing those politics. The Iraq, so it represents really the middle classes. Its class composition is middle class, particularly in the form of the Syrian and Iraqi nationalisms and Baathisms. There is a more revolutionary current in Arab nationalism, first really represented by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the revolutionary leader of Egypt, but really a revolutionary leftist split of that, which was led by George Habash and others after the 1967 war. And it's called the Arab Nationalist Movement, which then forms into the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, amongst others. And the PFLP is a revolutionary Marxist, anti-imperialist movement of the Palestinian people. So the Ba'athist state is attacked in 1990-91 by a massive coalition by basically the entire Western states, and also many Arab states, also including the Syrian state at the time as well, which is quite ironic considering how the Syrian state themselves have been attacked in a neo-colonial project through a joint enterprise between Putin and NATO, actually, from 2011 onwards. And this is something that in dialogue and conversation with leading Palestinian Revolution intellectual Adel Samara reminded me of, because he said that's a very important issue, because it sets the precedent for demolishing Arab nationalism, which is supposed to be the unity of the Arab people, and sets a precedent for Arab states invading each other under the auspices of the neo-colonial powers when it comes to 2011 with the conflicts in Libya by NATO and also in Syria, as been mentioned. So 1991, Iraq is attacked brutally. It kind of defines the New World Order by Bush the senior, a message to the world that do not defy our monopoly of power in the world after the collapse of the socialist bloc, otherwise you'll get this. And that's why Baghdad was utterly, brutally, so intensely bombed in that period. And then this genocidal sanctions regime is imposed by the West through the United Nations in Iraq. And the Iraqi Ba'athist state actually does quite well, and it receives a lot of praise for continuing to distribute wealth equally amongst the population, to keep basic services running, health, electricity and education, despite this brutal sanctions regime and a weekly bombing runs by Britain and the USA against it from 1990 all the way through to the invasion in 2003. So, as is well known, as is infamously known, the 2003 aggression against Iraq, led by Britain and the USA, that's the Tony Blair New Labour regime and Bush Jr.'s Republican administration in Washington, is conducted under lies. There was claims that Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath are allied to some Al-Qaeda group up in the in the Kurdish mountains in the north, just totally nonsensical rubbish. And then there was the 45 minutes claim that somehow Saddam's military could hit Western targets in 45 minutes, just totally debunked and nonsensical. And also the chemical weapons accusation, which Iraq was subjected to UN weapons inspections from 1991 all the way through to 2003, and it was proven that that was a total lie as well. But that all hides really why global capitalism decided to do that to Iraq. As aforementioned, it was intended as a lesson to everyone else. Don't do this. Don't be naughty. Don't defy our diktat across the world. Otherwise, you're going to get this, basically. And also, it indicated the only way, basically, global colonial capitalism responds to its deepening crisis of overproduction, which is born out of basically exploiting people and land, and then the producers can't buy the goods that they produce, and it causes crises through competition, the pursuit of the upper rate of profit and super profits, and this whole capitalist system is just designed to create crisis, and the only way it can resolve it is through social violence, and ultimately through these types of wars, particularly against so-called third world countries and the global working class. Now, when Britain and US invade in March 15th, 2003, actually British and US forces are stuck. They invade from the only small seaport that Iraq has in a village called Qasr. They're just stuck there. They're held there by the Iraqi resistance for weeks, and then they advance to north into Naziriyah and through southern Iraq, and the Iraqi resistance holds up the massive coalition of military terror, which is the combined forces of the US, Britain and other European armies, which just indicates just the strength of the Iraqi people, the defiance, the opposition to what they've been subjected to, and it has to be said, the organization of the Ba'athist state in preparing for the resistance. Because really the resistance initially is conducted, its mainstay is absolutely organized by Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi Ba'athist state. Now, there's also another big problem here connected to what was mentioned before about the class nature of the Ba'ath, the colonial imposed borders on the region, creating tension and conflict, and also very much the central divide and rule strategy of the West in the quote-unquote Muslim world, which is to fundamentally divide the two great sects of Muslims and Islam, the Shia and Sunni, against each other. And in that, the West manufacture and manipulate a 7-year war between the two greatest strategic threats to them in the region, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran on the one hand, and Ba'athist Iraq on the other hand. Ba'athist Iraq nationalizes the oil, sets up some kind of welfare state or socialist state or state capitalist state, however you want to analyze that. They deliver a successful education, health system, housing, land reform, and nationalization of the oil. Anyway, as the Iran-Iraq war is proceeding, it's sectarianized. Iran is posturing as, well, it's not. It's presenting itself as a religious sectarian movement around Shia, and Saddam Hussein also does posture to a certain extent, but is really, his ego is rubbed incessantly by the reactionary Sunni chauvinist regimes of the Gulf monarchies and the Jordanian monarchy. But it's a strategy of the West. This is all constructed, built up by British and US colonialism, especially, and Saddam falls into that, and it does become sectarianized. Despite the secular nature of the Ba'ath Arab nationalist Iraqi state and their defensiveness around this, that the majority of the leadership of the Ba'ath Party captured were majority Shia, that leading Shia figures historically were actually Arabs. All of these things are interesting, but really the politics does become sectarianized, and Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath do kind of fall into that, which is deeply problematic as we go forward into the resistance. There are several historic battles and sieges around important urban areas in Iraq around the resistance that we need to go into. There is the two sieges of Fallujah. First, from the 4th of April to the 1st of April, from the 4th of April to the 1st of May 2004. That's the first siege of Fallujah. Then the second siege of Fallujah from later that year, from the 7th of November to the 23rd of December 2004. There's also the Battle of Najaf in 2004 as well, for the month of August, basically, from the 5th of 27th of August 2004, which we'll go into. And there's also some other things. So let's go into this. Now, in Fallujah becomes a center for the Iraqi resistance. And that being so, a whole bunch of events leads to the military mercenary company of Blackwater. 4 of its staff are captured by the Iraqi popular resistance, and they are basically killed by them. You have to understand the amount of massive, brutal terror and violence that the British and US forces have impacted onto Iraq since 1991 in the bombing campaign, through weekly bombings from 1990 to 2003, and then the invasion was just, the sexual assault, the rape, the injury, the torture on a mass level against Iraqis. It was truly the depths of hell that the Iraqi people were forced into by the British and the USA. So it may seem like, oh my God, some acts of the Iraqi occupied people are just utterly brutal themselves, but really it's just a tiny asymmetric mirror image of violence of the colonialists. And actually Marx and Engels make a similar comment in their brilliant analysis of the First War of Independence in 1857 in India, when the British are complaining about the so-called atrocities of the Indian revolutionaries, and Marx and Engels said, well, frankly, the Indian colonized people are responding through the violence that they've been inspired by the colonial violence itself, and that revolutionary violence is actually justified and is a liberatory act. Similar things in the Haitian Revolution, similar things Frantz Fanon describes and analyzes as well. 4 Blackwater mercenary companies are captured and killed, and their bodies paraded by the Iraqi popular resistance in Fallujah. This leads to the invasion and the siege of the city by the USA and Britain, which leads to around a 100 of the coalition's so-called forces killed, and thousands of resistance fighters and civilians. This was one of the most intense battles that the US has ever faced and the British has ever faced. And it was the most intense battles that they faced since the Vietnamese War, giving some indication of the extent of brutality and intensity of that conflict. And then there's another siege of Fallujah and a battle in Fallujah later that year, in 7th of November to the 23rd of December 2004, in which again around 100 coalition forces are killed and thousands of resistance fighters. Now, what happens here is that it's both Sunni and Shia. From the Ba'athist leadership of Saddam Hussein, the Saddam Fedayeen, so-called, set up a whole bunch of resistance movements. The 1920 Brigades, the Islamic Army, the Army of Muhammad, the Ansar al-Sunnah, and there's other groups as well. These are all basically former Ba'athists then adopting a nationalist resistance movement that also overtly incorporates an Islamic character, but really it's nationalist and it's popular. It does involve a cross-class united front, and the force of which is workers and peasants actually, but because of the politics of it, although there are these social classes, the nature, the class composition of the political nature of these resistance movement is not exactly anti-colonial revolutionary in terms of the workers peasants class interest. It still represents a middle class because it does still adopt forms of right-wing nationalism, of right-wing Islamic nationalist politics as well, which all of these things cannot unite the masses. You can't unite the masses on a right-wing nationalist basis. You can't unite the masses while internalizing some level of right-wing religious sectarianism. It's impossible. But anyway, they were still very intense resistance moments in these two battles in Fallujah. Now, also we have to reference this. Uday Hussein is a largely reviled figure, one of the sons of Saddam Hussein, a very brutal figure. Nevertheless, on 22nd of July 2003, Uday Hussein and his 14-year-old son Mustafa Uday, which is Saddam Hussein's grandson, is under siege by whole infantry divisions of the US Army in their residential home. And they fight for the whole day. And the 14-year-old Mustafa continues to fire back at the US Army after the death of his father, and then eventually he is killed. I mean, surface-to-land missiles are I think 3 of which were targeted on that day on Uday and Mustafa Hussein. It was just incredible. I mean, one's not to defend Uday Hussein at all, but the fact that a 14-year-old stood up and it was to the colonialists in that way, it's an incredible moment. But in Fallujah, going back to Fallujah, it's a united movement as well. It's because there's also majority Shia militia involved in the defense of Fallujah as well. And then there's another siege of Najaf in 2004, again, from the 5th to the 27th of August. And this is around one of the biggest cemeteries in the world and in the Muslim world, and the important religious buildings there. It was led by Muqtada al-Sadr and his Mahdi army, which have been proven more recently to be totally opportunist, flip-flopping all over the place, in the pockets of Riyadh, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, etc. Total opportunist. But there was a battle against the colonial occupation forces that did fight back hard and did create some victories there. So again, it was more of majority Shia there, with minimal involvement from groups that are in the resistance that are majority Sunni. And all the time you have the emergence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and other violently sectarian groups on the Sunni side, but also on the Shia side as well. And it's Al-Qaeda in Iraq is led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a criminal from Jordan, from Zarqa, that's why it's called Zarqawi, and he was involved in the Afghan War from 1989 to 1998, which again is another project of particularly British and US colonialism in Afghanistan. He's also again involved in Afghanistan around the resistance to the US and British invasion there in 01, and then he sets up his group in Iraq, and the leaders of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri, give him the franchise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and he accepts it. I mean, bin Laden and Zawahiri, I think it's quite clear now that both these figures and Al-Qaeda has deep connections and collusion and infiltration, and basically controlled by British and US military intelligence services. Osama bin Laden ends up just chilling out in a military town in Pakistan before he's killed by US forces in Abbottabad, indicating that this is a racket. This is a US and British racket. And then more recently, with the Libya conflict in 2011, the leading NATO countries are very comfortable with Al-Qaeda organizations, some of which come and blow up Paris and Manchester, with the infamous case of Salman Abedi. And you can also see in Syria, around the occupation of different parts of Syria by the Turkish authorities, that again open Al-Qaeda factions are in open alliance with the British, the French, and the US. So really, when Zarqawi sets up his violently sectarian movement, but also formidably targeting the US occupation forces, this creates as a result of the military intelligence strategies of the British and the US, this deepens their main mechanism to neutralize the resistance, which is to sectarianize it, and that is successfully done. A brutal sectarian civil war, also concurrently with the Iraqi resistance against the US and Britain, develops on the timeline as we are discussing it. You also have to keep in mind that the Palestinian Intifada erupts in September 2000 and basically peters out by February 2005. And then in March the 15th, 2003, Iraq is invaded. So these two things fuse together and they feed off each other and they radicalize each other. And that's a relatively healthier dynamic, because the Palestinian struggle is not sectarianized, is a universal cause célèbre of the global oppressed. And so that's a healthier dynamic. But Iraq sectarianizes and deepens the sectarianization. Well, one says Iraq, but really it's the British and the American by means of its sectarian Gulf states. You have to remember the number one ally of the West in the region is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda, and then what goes on to be Al-Qaeda in Iraq becomes the Islamic State, becomes Daesh. It's the same thing. That they have the same ideology. It's the Wahhabi ideology of Ibn Wahhab, which is one of the leaders of and junior partners of the British colonialist who sets up the Saudi state in the I think it's the late 18th century, going to the 19th century. Anyway, but the Palestinian Intifada petering out also has a negative effect on the Iraqi resistance, that it allows just the sectarianism just to go wild in Iraq. There's another really important incident that we have to take into consideration here as well. That September 2005, the British were caught by Iraqi authorities in Basra. These are covert military operatives of the British Army around the Force Research Unit. Very important. They're caught dressed as Arabs with explosives. And this points to the way the British are well practiced and experienced in similar operations in their colonization and occupation of Ireland, which they still control today in the northern occupied 6 counties. The Force Research Unit was very much deployed in Ireland. The Brits claim that it was disbanded in 2007. But September 2005, Basra authorities captured these covert operatives. Obviously, it seems going to plant a bomb somewhere against Shia, and then obviously most likely claim claim it was some Sunni armed group. And what happens next is that the local Basra police capture these Brits, and then the Brits launch an operation. They break down the walls of the police prison holding cell, and they release their colleagues, their British Army colleagues. This sparks protests where the Iraqi masses in Basra attack British army personnel and their armoured personal carriers and tanks, leading to famous images of British soldiers are set afire by Molotov cocktails and fire bombs, and jump out of their armoured carriers alight on fire. But one should really study the Force Research Unit and these kind of divide and rule violent tactics. Also on 22nd of February 2006, the Al-Askari shrine is bombed by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Well, Al-Qaeda in Iraq claim it. This deepens the sectarian divide massively, because it's one of the most important shrines for the Shia in general and in Iraq as well. And then Saddam Hussein himself, after the debacle of the so-called trial of Saddam Hussein, whereby Saddam Hussein just ran rings around the judges and the whole proceedings and used it as a platform to advocate for dignity and resistance of the Iraqi people. Saddam Hussein is executed on the 30th December 2006. He's executed by what seems to be the militia of Muqtada al-Sadr of the al-Mahdi, who film it and claim it publicly in a very proud way. Another disgusting sectarian movement, really humiliates a lot of Iraqi people who happen to be in the Sunni community, deepens again the sectarian divide amongst the Iraqi people. All the time, despite the sectarian nature of the Iraqi situation, the Iraqi resistance sucks in nearly totally the energies of British and US colonial states, allowing many other countries to rise in the world, not least Russia and China and India and Brazil, leading to the rise of the BRICS, and also giving space to the rest of the global south to have a bit of respite to develop things there. And it's also a very inspiring moment, because the Iraqi resistance does inspire the global oppressed, and it does radicalize to a certain extent despite the problematics and the dysfunctionalities here. And you have this kind of alliance of global leaders of Chavez, Mugabe, even Ahmadinejad and others, and it seemed like there was something wonderful happening, and we're pushing forward in towards a more liberatory kind of process for humanity. Of course, that was all very short-lived, and it's a very sobering developments ever since that shows how incorrect basically those notions and perceptions and feelings were back then, and actually, more importantly, what the massive obstacles and challenges remain for the global south, that really we're still in a very much in a place as we enter into this multipolar world that's still perpetuating the same politics of right-wing racism, anti-people politics, right-wing capitalism, etc. But it has to be still stated that the Iraqi resistance did allow that to happen, did allow the BRICS to rise and the global south to rise. And that's an important point to make there. Then really, as the situation sectarianizes by means of the British and the US agendas and frameworks of divide and rule, in which local actors definitely feed into that, including the Islamic Republic of Iran, which continuously plays quite a negative role in all of this, particularly their agent Sistani, who's really a toxic figure in all of this regards. And of course we discussed also the chauvinism from the sectarian forces from the Sunni side as well, feeding into the British and US agendas there. So really, from the execution of Saddam Hussein in December 2006, it's just a short time until the Arab Spring, or perhaps what other people call the Arab Sting, breaks out, in which, again, like the war against Iraq in 1990-91, where the British and the US are developing a neo-colonial war machine with local actors and local Arab states, you have the same thing again with Libya in 2011, with Qatar leading the death squads in Libya as proxy forces for NATO, with all the Gulf monarchies involving themselves in that, and also other non-monarchist Arab entities and regimes and movements as well involving themselves there. And similarly with Syria, you have again militias supported by all manner of client states of the British and the US involving themselves violently into Syria and helping to, and also Russia also being a major player there that helps to partition Syria along with his formally invited Western imperialist partners in the partition and the occupations of Syria. So you can see how really the strategic defeats of the Iraqi resistance leads then to all of these disastrous situations. And also today, the Iraqi state, the Baghdad state, it's still a colonial state. It's an occupied state. Tehran and Baghdad and Lebanese Hezbollah and this, and those who follow the white nationalist leader Alexander Dugin around platforms like the Cradle, and obviously Russia Today, and even Al-Mayadeen, they all claim that somehow, that Syria is a great victory and, Putin is a great savior. But actually what's clearly going on is a joint strategy by NATO, Turkey, Israel and Russia together in a joint enterprise to fail everyone else in the region. And so what could have been if the Iraqi resistance could have united the Iraqi people and sought victories? Well, we don't know that because really we haven't seen that ever since some anti-colonial victories, well, radical ones in the form of the Vietnamese and others. We haven't seen that for generations now, and it goes back to the beginning of this particular discussion as to the class nature, and we're only going to have the kind of political leadership and the class consciousness and the class character of political organizations and leadership if we actually have the battle of ideas. That's really not being conducted on the side of radical anti-colonial socialist politics, because it's being glossed over and trammeled over by the victories of Western right-wing colonial politics and toxicities, and then joining in by the Eastern mirror images of that. But that remains the challenge, is to put, and that's one of the main strategies of the counter-narrative news project, which is to put out these ideologies, these histories, these conversations, so we can grow these strategies to inform real struggles in the world and to popularize what's happening around that, to then try and take this whole project to meet the challenges which are still the overthrow of all right-wing capitalist colonial ideas and infrastructures and global relations, and to replace it with a community of states and peoples in a socialist direction. We can manage the environment and the wealth created by the labor of the global working class in an equitable, in an environmentally friendly way, because we all fundamentally rely on the environment, and to really create happiness and stability, and so people can really flourish culturally and intellectually and socially, rather than this insidious, growing, depressive, alienated right-wing toxicities that we're all currently living through. Hope that was of some use. One has to commend all the countless martyrs in Iraq who stood up in whatever way. There's many things about Iraq in this that we haven't shared and discussed. Really, the grandmothers, the mothers, and the children of Iraq, our hearts are with them. And this was something that I personally lived through, and I was very active around. And And yeah, they shone brightly, and that beacon of resistance that the Iraqi people contributed will, like the Vietnamese, like the Mau Mau Kikuyu resistance in Kenya, like the Haitian Revolution and the other slave rebellions across Cuba and Jamaica and Brazil and other places, the Iraqi resistance will remain an inspirational beacon despite all of its sad and tragic dynamics. Many thanks.